Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. I'm Andrew Billings, and this is my wife,
Rebekah Billings.
And today we're going to be talking about
Singleness.
Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Rebekah.
And we are the Billings, and this is Formation, and we're going to continue this conversation around singleness and the stagnancy of a whole generation that seems to be having failure to launch, transitioning from being single into healthy relationships that lead to marriage. So let's just jump into this.
Yeah. Previously we were talking about, it's kind of turned into this pandemic in the body of Christ. And how I'd said, I thought it was just our church or just a few handful of churches we'd known. But then we found out it's kind of everywhere.
It's everywhere.
I truly believe it's a reflection of the social media's influence and the increase of selfishness, the internet, and different things that have influenced our culture. And we were talking about how, the outside culture of the world is kind of seeping into the church. And instead of, as daughters and sons of God, hearing from the Holy Spirit on how to date or get married, all the things, we're using secular, soulish tools or ways or frames to try and apply that to who we're going to marry, and it's trashed. Yeah. And so we want to talk about it because we want to help all those singles out there get on track and get married, because as we said in the other podcast, it is the will of God for you to be married. And I think that's a big question mark, especially if you've been single a long time. You begin to think something's wrong with you, or God's mad at you and he's punishing you, or you're too old now, because you're looking on the internet and everyone's 20 years old and you look at yourself 30 something and you think you're just washed up or too set in your ways. It's just God designed
You're starting
marriage.
to buy your clothes at Costco.
No, well.
Yeah, I got you.
But God designed marriage, and we can't let the enemy come in and lie to us and make us the problem or make God the problem. It's like, no, it was actually his idea before it was our idea.
Right.
And we need to kind of get down to what's the disconnect here? Yeah. If it's God's plan and our desire, then why is it not happening? And why are people remaining single? Right. And sometimes the argument can be, well, there's just not a lot of men in the church. It's all women, especially in charismatic circles, it tends to be heavy with females, but I don't believe that. I think there are godly men and women around to be married. It's just a matter of preparing, and which is what we want to talk about today, and really keying into how we can delete the disconnect. Right. And so really it comes to, and you can chime in on this, is how am I preparing? How am I processing? How am I living my life in a way that's going to be able to hear God? Right. And find who he has planned for me to marry.
Yeah, and just while you're talking, I'm thinking about the process, and this is kind of like a parallel example, but I'm thinking about the process of the children of Israel. They have 400 years of slavery. So they're stuck, they're existing, but they don't have the freedom to be all that they believe they can be as humans, as people. And so God sends Moses and Aaron, and there's this mighty deliverance, and they come out of Egypt, right? Then there's this whole process of this transition, 40 years in a desert, disobedience, obedience, good moments, really stupid moments, faith, no faith, and then they cross over into the promised land. They defeat giants, they establish cities, and they start to be consolidated in their own standing with their own nation, with their own land, right? But then there's this moment that as they're starting to consolidate their land and their cities and their nation now that God's given them, the original promise God gave to Abraham, there's this idea that pops up in their kind of military circles. Hey, Egypt makes really good chariots. Yeah. Let's go to Egypt and buy some of their chariots, because they've got. It's kind of like the world buys M1A Abrams tanks and F-22s and F-18s and F-16s from the United States, because the United States has a lot of technology that's made really good weaponry and equipment. And so Israel starts contemplating this whole idea of let's go to Egypt to get our military strength secured. And God sends a prophet. He starts to speak, and he's like, do not go to Egypt for your strength.
Right.
Now, why are we talking about this in the middle of a dating conversation? Because here's the deal. As a child of God, you have been extracted, you've been delivered, you've been set free from the systems of the world. It's not just that God set you free from sin. It's that God set you free from the systems, the narrative, the rules, the benchmark of the world system. And so we come into our walk with God, we turn up in church culture, we turn up in, colloquial Christian language, and we start to learn how to navigate life and social scenarios, right? And so then you enter the dating world, and the problem is that in the course of time, the last 20, 30 years, I'll speak to the American church for right now, because that's where we've mostly been speaking, or mostly been, working in ministry, is the systems and the social values of that Egypt world system have somehow intertwined and overlapped and crept in and infiltrated the church. So you'll have people that will fully defend the value systems of the world that have now somehow crept into the church. And so why are we saying that? We're talking about dating and how to prepare yourself.
Singleness, yeah.
So the way that the world prepares for dating should be different than the way that a son or daughter of God prepares for dating. Yeah. You can't, get in the church and then go back to the world for the benefits of how they do it so that you can get yourself a catch. Because I'll tell you right now, I love hunting and fishing. Okay, and with fishing, primarily most of the fishing I do has to do with either a lure or a bait. And in the lure or the bait, you are the specific hook you choose, and the specific bait you choose will perfectly dictate the kind of fish you're catching, almost 99%. So you could have a bunch of tuna underneath your boat, but if you are putting a different type of food that they don't eat on your hook and dropping it down, there's a pretty big chance that you can have tons of fish swimming past you, but you're not going to catch. So if you're using, and you might end up catching a shark instead of a tuna, right? And so if you're using the world or those Egyptian chariots in the example I've just given, in the way that you're preparing yourself to somehow connect with someone in the church, if you have the wrong lure and bait on, metaphorically, you can end up connecting with the wrong person, and that can be a devastating trail in your life. So I just wanted to paint that picture before we went down this road. This is why this conversation matters. Right. Because you are now a chosen people, a royal priesthood. So you're peculiar. You're abnormal. You're not to live, it says in Romans 12, 1 and 2, not to be conformed to this world any longer, but to be transformed by the renewing of your minds. That means my thinking, my value systems, my orientation has to change by the renewing of your mind through the washing of the Word of God. So that means that I have to find, if I truly want to find, and then it goes on to say, so that you may be able to recognize, discern, know that, which is the good, perfect, and acceptable will of God. And so what that means is, and if I'm going to find God's will in a spouse, or if I'm single, which I'm not, but if I was single and I wanted to find God's will in my life for who that spouse was, I'm not to go about it with a secular mindset or system or some kind of approach. Yeah. So I just want to kind of level that as we start this, because it's really important for us as this conversation, because it's not just us, it's the viewers, it's everyone watching. By the way, share this if you are starting to latch onto this conversation and enjoying it. But it's so important that before we start a journey, if I'm going to walk 100 miles, it's not that I can just point somewhere in the right direction. I better have, if it's going to be 180.75 degrees, I better make sure it's exactly that when I'm walking, because if it's 175, I could end up 20 miles in the wrong direction by the time I've traveled 100 miles, because it just starts doing this. Yeah. So let's start this conversation by setting out this idea of God's ways are not our ways. And sometimes God's ways seem foolish to us, and vice versa, right? So what we have to do is find where God is in our dating lives and invite Holy Spirit to be the Uncle Mordecai that guides us and coaches us to be picked by the king, if that makes sense, in a dating sense.
Yes.
Yeah, or queen, whatever.
Yeah. I think, too, really, all of this surrounds how you can hear God and where you're at in your relationship with God to be able to hear him, because God has such a specific plan for each of us that you might pick up a book like I Kissed Dating Goodbye. That was a big book when we were younger. I don't know if
you've since renounced that. That guy renounced that, by the way.
But like, you have all these separate opinions. Like, what you need, the first thing you need to do when it comes to singleness, the path that leads to the spouse, all the things, it's actually more about you learning how to hear the voice of God than it is about finding a spouse yet. Right. You can't even get to that until you can learn to hear God's voice, because how are you going to hear him guiding you to a person if you don't know how to hear him on the day-to-day?
Right.
And I think sometimes when it comes to singleness, people all of a sudden turn that on, like, oh God, I need to hear you now. What are you saying about my spouse? He's like, I want you to hear my voice all the time.
Yeah.
And you don't want to turn God's voice on and off whenever you need to hear him on something that's really important. It's like you need to cultivate an intimacy, a relationship with God that applies to every area of your life, not just the singleness. You don't just freak out on all the singleness and then, say you do somehow, maybe you don't see God a lot, but then you single and you're praying and you like hone in on hearing God's voice for who you're going to marry. Say you find your spouse, and then your foot gets off the gas in regards to hearing God's voice. And then because you haven't built that in your life, you get married, and then you're a train wreck because you really didn't teach yourself how to hear God in your life. You just trying to hone in and maybe fumbled your way into actually hearing God on something. But his heart is that you're restored to the Garden of Eden.
Next thing, next place I have to go, next person I have to meet.
And so I think that is where you start as a single person. You start in learning to hear the voice of God, because as you exercise that muscle and learn to get to know him and be led by him, when it comes to big decisions, you have a foundation and you have learned to hear him. And so I really believe that's where you start. You might have been hearing us and you're like, okay, I love this. I agree God has a plan. I don't want to choose myself, but I don't know where to start. This is where you start. Actually, a relationship with God, not a relationship with anyone else.
Right.
And like people say, this was like a term when I was growing up, which is, I don't know if it's still floating around, but it's like, you got to be married to Jesus first before you can marry anyone else, which some people find that a weird thing to say, but it's true in concept. Like, you have to.
Well, we are the bride of Christ.
You have to. You know how people get it. You have to be in love with him and walking with him first. Because once you get married, it's not like, single people do this. It's like the goal of marriage. Like, I'm running towards the finish line, and they finally get there and they're like,
what do I do with this?
They're like, ooh, and then they fall over and they're like, oh, and we've said this a lot, but you need to be a whole single person, healed from your wounds as to the best of your walk with, and done the character work so that when you get married, a whole person is coming into a marriage, not half a person. And we said this is what we always say. 2 half people don't make a whole person. 2 whole people make a whole marriage.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And such an important point.
And so the best and first place you should really be going after is your relationship with the Lord, how much time you spend with him, how well you can hear his voice, or how much are you led? Is he your shepherd? Are you being led by him as a sheep? Like, some of you want to go down in these deep marriage seminars, preparation for marriage. Like, you can't even hear God's voice. Like, you ain't even ready for that. That's the meat after you've had milk, you know.
Just because you can get a pair of keys and sit in the car of a Ferrari and say that you own it doesn't mean that you know how to drive it. Like, so for instance, driving a supercar is very different than driving like a Toyota Camry.
Yes.
You have to learn how to drive that thing. Yeah. And so you don't just get in and say, cool, I got the car. It's learning and training yourself how to handle yourself. Like, so when you're coming in at a really high speed to a corner in a vehicle like that, you've got to know what you're doing, or you can panic and that car can flip and roll and there goes
right.
$500,000.
Right.
And so, you know, I think it's really important that we don't mix up appetite for master building. And so what I mean by that is our hunger to get a desire of being fulfilled in a marriage. It's like, oh yeah, that's a really nice car. Well, I'm really hungry to be married. I'm so ready to be married because I'm so tired of being alone. So what you're saying is you don't like being alone, so you want to be married. So that's a fix. It's not a fulfillment. And this is where a lot of people come unstuck, is that they're actually running from their discomfort of who they are when they're by themselves. Because they haven't learned to be comfortable with Jesus on their own,
right.
That marriage is now a fix. But then when they get to marriage and it gets awkward, because marriage will amplify all the dysfunction that you've refused to deal with.
It's like a magnifying glass.
Yeah, I mean, the first 5 to 7 years of most marriages are usually a really interesting period of time where people are learning how to work with each other, and
right.
there's sharp edges are grinding, and like you've got all of these different things. The areas that are unrefined are kind of abrasively sparks flying. And so it's learning to kind of like shift and prefer the other. But if you haven't dealt with you and Jesus when
right.
it's difficult or it's uncomfortable or it's lonely, marriage is not going to fix it. It's
right.
going to amplify the dysfunction.
Yeah.
And so it's super important that you understand that just because you can get keys and get in and stand at the front of an altar and have all your family come and cry and cut a cake and dance on the dance floor and take beautiful pictures, that doesn't mean you're married. That just means you did a ceremony. You're gonna have to earn this thing with the way that you steward yourself and you steward this other person. And that is going to take hard work, sitting through awkward conversations, dealing with each other's pain at times, dealing with being the source of that pain, dealing with all of the vulnerable stuff that you can't just hang the phone up now. You can't just say good night, I'll see you next week, or see you tomorrow. Now you're in bed with that person. You got to wake up and you got to work through stuff. Now, marriage is amazing. It's full of so much joy, but it's also very confronting if you're used to being, because singleness, the longer you're single, the more selfish and self-centered you become, and you don't even realize it. It's because all you have to do is take care of you. And so you'll say, oh no, I'm the most caring, kind, humble person, and I'm just such a giving person, until you're married. And then you're confronted with what's really in you and the fact that you have only really been caring for yourself. So marriage is actually not designed to just be a fulfillment, but it's designed by God to refine you to a new level of understanding what it looks like to be walking with God, being refined in character, being matured, being developed. So marriage is, it's on some levels, it's a beautiful, I wouldn't exchange it for anything. I'm so happy in marriage. But at the same time, it can be at times a crucible that refines you. Yeah. And, even Paul said, he's like, for those that are married, there's some difficulties there. Right. But it's also beautifully fulfilling. So we say all that to not scare anybody, but to actually just lay cards on the table and say, hey, maybe no one's told you this. This is the reality. And so you don't turn up to a marathon having never run before.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting. I remember being single and hearing people say things like this. And I'm like, yeah, but you get to be married. Do you ever listen to people? They're like, I'm like, don't tell me marriage is hard. You're like, you get to be married. You've crossed the finish line. You got to do, but you just have to do your best to trust. You might be hearing this kind of thing a lot, that marriage is a challenge, because it's true. That's why it's said a lot. It's true. And you just have to trust that is a real thing and not just something you can write off because that's what married people say, Yeah,
it's not.
And I think just on the topic of how to prepare and what you can do, I think another thing to think about is being among the harvest for God. Sometimes there's only so much you can do. Like, okay, I'm praying, I'm working on myself, but it's not until you like get immersed in something where things pop up, and in unique ways. But sometimes I think as singles, they're like, well, I'm at home and I'm reading all my self-help books, and you won't get out into the gospel and do anything because you're like preparing for marriage, and I'm reading my marriage books, and I'm listening to my marriage podcasts, and it's like, okay, that has a place, but that's not the only way to all the knowledge. It's really, that's this generation. Like, just let me accumulate all the knowledge I can, and that's my preparation. I read the 20 books, and now I can regurgitate knowledge that I have no experience or real revelation of. You just have words. It's not a revelation. And I think one of the best ways to allow the Holy Spirit to do a deeper work in your character and your heart is actually to put yourself in the harvest. What do I mean by that? Do the gospel. And so how is this preparation for marriage? Well, if you look in the Bible, if you look at Ruth, she got in Boaz's field and she worked. And
right.
It was not like the glamorous with all the other workers. She was picking out the scraps after everyone else got the goods, but she was willing to be in the harvest, working, doing what she could for Naomi, and Boaz saw her. She didn't have her head up in the field waving at Boaz, trying to get his attention, right? She wasn't like haying from the field like, yo, Boaz, what's up? Like, no, her head was down. Her head was down working, and she had her head in the harvest.
Yeah.
And Boaz saw her because she was in the harvest. And the same actually with Rebekah in the Bible that I wanted to mention. Abraham's servant, who P.S. asked God to please lead him to whoever the wife for Isaac would be. So if you don't think God leads people to find spouses, it's scripturally right there. Right. Abraham's servant was saying, please show me who is she going to be. And Rebekah was another one who was working. She was giving water to the camels, and she was out there doing what she needed to be doing. And I think sometimes single people, they isolate themselves like, oh, I better not, I'm just going to sit here and read my single books and on singleness or my marriage and make myself smart. It's like, no, get in the harvest. You get amongst the work. What's going on at your church? Like, get involved. Go evangelize. Feed people. Like, just stop being a weird single person that's prepping for marriage, actually doing very minimal.
Yeah.
What God rewards, and he fashions people who are willing to put their hands to things. And in both of those examples, in Ruth and Rebekah, they both got married and they both became lineage to Jesus. They were not doing nothing. They had their heads down in the harvest. And I think that's a key for single people.
That's good.
Is to be busy about your Father's business, and he will cause your spouse. Boaz will see you in the field. Abraham's servant will be sent to you because you will be putting your hands to the plow and being diligent. And honestly,
yeah, that's good.
That's the kind of spouse you want to find, too. The one who's in God's kingdom doing the work. I mean, how many of you, you can comment on this, but like, guys go into a church and they see all the single girls like looking all pretty and they're all pristine. They're sitting there and it's like they're hardly engaging. This in the most loving way. There's not a lot of substance. You might look pretty on the outside.
Shallow as a puddle.
But it's like, and I feel like that's a big group of people. They're just like
real men don't want shallow puddles.
And you want someone who's in the harvest. And so if that's what you want, you should be that for someone else.
Yeah, look, here's where it's at. Like, what we've got is we've got a whole bunch of fools right now out in the world talking about high-value men and high-value women. And they're basing that on how much money the man makes and how much of a woman's body she can show to attract a high-value man that only is interested in that kind of thing and empowering him to make more money. And so that's the whole reason that we started talking about this whole idea of, like, don't go to Egypt for your chariots. Now, here's the deal. A woman wants a man that is strong, centered in Jesus, clear, moving in a direction, motivated, a breadwinner. He's not sitting at home saying God's going to make me a millionaire and doesn't have a job and hasn't had a job in 5 years.
Come on, yeah.
Right? Bumming off everyone for some kind of GoFundMe. I'm a missionary, but I don't really do any real work. I just show up and do some street evangelism. Do that in your spare time, okay? Go and make some money.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about worshiping money. I'm talking about go and work hard so that you can be a provider. The Bible says that he who doesn't provide for his own house is worse than an unbeliever. Okay? So there's other words that are used, but I'm just going to leave it at that for now. So where are we heading with this? What we're heading with is that if you can't, like Paul said to Timothy, hey, Timothy, study to show yourself approved, a workman that need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. So if you truly divide the word of truth, you're not just going to have great eschatology and theology. You're going to have great ethics and lifestyle and culture and character, that you are going somewhere and doing something. Like, you know, I've coached young men, and some of these young men, I'm like, why do you always avoid hard work and services and meetings, and you let other people do it, and you kind of try to look busy, and you try to skim around the outside of the circle, do a whole lot of talking, look like you're important, and you're really not. We're just all servants of the King, and you actually never get involved in hard work, because the reality is everyone in the room, including women that could potentially be assessing you as someone as a possible husband, are noting the fact that you are just really great at making everyone think that they're so stupid that they don't realize that you're avoiding any real hard work. That stuff matters, and everyone in the room sees that. Right? And the same for the same for ladies. Like, if you're just constantly caught up in drama and low-level Christianity, you have the bait on a hook that's going to catch a shark. You're going to catch someone that really isn't interested in really running for Jesus. They just want to have church culture and the community of church, but they don't want to ever do anything of substance for God. Right? So here's the deal. To men, I would say to you, guys, you need to seek Jesus with all your heart. You need to be socially healthy, where you're not just some monk hermit that stays at home and reads the Bible. You're not going to get a wife staying home reading the Bible. You need to have intimacy with Jesus. You also need to have a job or a business. You need to show stability. You need financial stability, emotional, spiritual, social stability, right? You need to be someone that is pushing forward, so that if a woman looks at you and says, this is a man that can provide for me, right? Because she can hear God all she wants, but at the same time, she's got to look at you and go, this makes sense. Right? Otherwise, it's just popcorn prophecy.
Right.
And so one of the things I'm just going to speak to you right here is that, like, fear drives a lot of people. And I know that we're talking about preparing yourself, but I just want to add this in here, because I met Bex in a small church. It was about 300-400 people. It was a small church. Maybe a medium church where we were, but it wasn't big. Now, I can tell you, as a young single man in my 20s, that a lot of the pretty girls were in these big churches that you can now, that, you know, I look at them and like they're meat markets. It's where all the single people go to kind of mingle. It's like a Christian nightclub in the day with a couple of worship songs at the start. Everyone's checking each other out. Everyone has inappropriate inboxes. Everyone is having unhealthy rendezvous. I'm just going to say it right now. Okay, I'm going to say it right now. It creates a nightclub culture, and I'm not even saying that the church is wrong, but the thing is that just because everyone that's the who's who, or the pretty people, or the healthy people, or the wealthy people are gathered there means that where God's going to provide for you. So I was in a small church serving. There wasn't really a whole bunch of girls that I was interested in the church that we were in, but God brought the women that he had for me to the church where I was. So why you feel like Abraham and Sarah, that you have to help God? The minute I have to help God, somehow I'm not trusting God. I'm actually trusting myself. So I'm not spiritually mature. I'm just full of lust. And I'm full of fear because I don't trust God. I don't depend on him. I depend on myself. So really I have to say, who's my God? So if I'm really truly God's and I truly trust him, then what I'm going to do, I'm saying some stuff right now. Hopefully it's okay. It's going to make someone mad and someone happy. I love it. If I truly trust God, what I'm going to do is, like Ruth, Naomi, all these things, even Esther, I am going to put my head down. I'm going to work. I'm going to pursue heaven. I'm going to do everything that my hands find to do. That my job, staying healthy at the gym, being healthy in community. I'm not going to be overly flirtatious.
Really good.
And I think all young people can struggle with this at times. Like I probably didn't have, like for me when I was in my 20s, I didn't realize that sometimes being nice at church got me in trouble. You saw this. I'd open doors at church like a gentleman should, and some girls got the idea that, you know, oh, he's interested, or they went to the pastors and asked if they could marry me, and there was like a definite no on that. okay? Because that was some serious, like, crack cocaine thinking. Because it just was never, that wasn't even going to happen in a million years. So the reason I'm saying that, the reason I'm just being so blasé, and also, to be honest with you, I was young, I'd come out of a really messed up upbringing in church, and so on a lot of levels, I had some not really healthy ideas of what healthy looked like, and like the hoes and the bros in the world, or that have to put themselves out there in an unhealthy way, that have to flirt using their body, that have to flirt using seduction, or... See, there's a difference between being charming as a nice person and being a charmer, a seductive person. Okay, there's a big difference. And you need to learn that, ladies. With the men, you need to learn there's a difference between someone that's charming and that's a charmer.
Yeah.
Men, you need to learn the difference between someone that has beauty on the inside versus someone that has none, so they have to magnify all their beauty on the outside to compensate. You got to know the difference. You got to understand the difference between some girl that has no personality because she's never ever been through difficult things in life, and so she is putting all of her efforts into her physical appearance and her seductive charm that's trying to woo you and put you into a daze and a haze so that you just like go along. Okay, and so why am I being so blunt on this topic? It's because this is where most people lose their way on their path with God.
Right. Yeah.
I've watched most people being taken out in unhealthy relationships. Pastoring for 13 plus years and on pastoral team for 12 years prior to that. I've watched most people get taken out in this area. They'll come to Jesus and all of a sudden there's an unhealthy relationship that shows up. They lose their zeal, they lose their love, they lose their purity, they lose their innocence, and then you don't see them anymore.
Yeah.
And it's just that simple. Or they stay in the church, but something in their spirit dies. And they're there physically, but spiritually the lights are off. And, but they've still got all the language. They can still navigate their way through conversations and community, but it's just, there's just something not there anymore. So why are we saying all this? Because you can go to Egypt for your chariots. You can go to the big who's who church. You can go to the popular church. You can go, where churches where it's completely acceptable for girls to dress at a way that would be, deemed inappropriate in a lot of places. You can go to places where it's just a known... Do you guys call it meat market? Because that's where I call it, where I come from. I call it a meat market. Okay, where you're just going to check out the stock. You're going to look at what's on the shelves. Okay, and you're just there checking out. You're walking in the room. You're scanning the room. Like that stuff, guys. That's not church. Just be honest and go back into the world and go to the club. Yeah. Just be honest with yourself, because that's what it is. It's just dressed up a little nicer. So for us, like I know that I just made a decision in my heart. If God's God, He can bring my wife to me where I am. And I'm not going to let fear drive me. I'm not going to let it intimidate me. I'm not going to let it make me anxious or hasty or desperate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let Jesus go first. Right. And so that's what we did. And I just stayed where I was. And then lo and behold, God brings you along.
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to, again, establishing a relationship with the Lord and being led by Him. Yeah. Not driven by fear. Right. Or soulish ideas. Yeah. And it comes back to, as well, it's like the best thing you can do to prepare for marriage or whatever is seek God, get in the harvest, but also just work on yourself the best you can. Right. Because a lot of people are like flicking through their dating apps, judging everybody else, but they're not working on themselves. Ooh. It's like, again, the meat market. You're coming in for the meat market. Well, what are you bringing to the meat market? And not that we want any meat markets.
We don't want meat markets.
But you know what I'm saying? It's the idea that...
You don't want meat markets, at least.
But it's like, it's the idea that you have this expectation that you're going to have this... Right. 20-star person, and yet who are you? What are you bringing to the marriage table? And this is not something you do after you're married. A lot of people are like, well, once I get married, I'll really just, no. Now act like you're married. Who do you want to be who do you want to be to someone? Because if you have a big expectation about, my list, I talked about that in the last podcast. I got my list. Okay, but who are you? who are you? What kind of list are you?
What value? You want a high value man? Where's your high value?
Well, it's
now,
like,
there's the value that Jesus brought, but what have you done with that?
And I'm not talking about the eternal value of your soul. I'm talking about...
We're not talking about identity stuff. We're talking about development.
I'm talking about development, like being on time for things, making your bed, showering people. I mean, you would think...
Deodorant.
You would think you wouldn't have to say that. But some people, they go days on... It's like, what are you bringing to the table to be a blessing to someone else's life instead of emphasizing everything? Your prayers, everything. Like you pray and you're like, God, I want, and you got your list. It's like God's looking at you like, okay, let's figure out what kind of list you're going to be for somebody. You know, maybe instead of being so like outward focused on the package or what they have to be, it's like, why don't you work on what you're going to be? Because let me tell you, when you get married, you can't be thinking about my spouse better give me all these things all the time. You need to think about how am I going to be a blessing to my spouse? How am I going to lay down my life for my spouse? Because that, both parties laying down their lives for each other makes for a good marriage. Not both people demanding, requesting, nitpicking, judging. It's like, no, change the mentality. How can I serve?
Right.
How can I serve my spouse is how a good marriage works. So right now, as a single person, you could cultivate that way of living right now. And how am I going to be a blessing to someone else in the future of my life? Let me work on how my serving muscle, like how am I serving people? This is another one. How are my friendships? How good of a friend am I? You want to have a spouse that's going to be like the best friend of your whole life, but you don't know how to have one regular friend.
Right.
Because you're a weirdo Netflix person or YouTube whatever person, and you don't know how to have a regular trusted relationship. Like, don't even be trying to be married if you can't have a good friendship.
Right.
And so, that's something to think about. I think the emphasis is so much on what someone else should be. Let's think about what you should be. Let's think about what are the fruits of the Spirit that I can be working on in my life.
Right.
How can I be a blessing? Because that Jesus didn't come to be served, he came to serve. That's who you should be in preparing to be married, is someone who knows how to serve, someone who knows how to have character, integrity. Work on yourself. And I'm talking, work on yourself in so many different ways. Yeah.
If I can just jump in on this, and I think really what we're doing here, our hope with this particular session right now, this episode, was to really go down how to prepare yourself. But I think what we're actually doing, we're discovering, is that we're having to bring perspective on what even preparing yourself is about.
Yes.
So what we'll do in the next session is we'll actually talk a bit more in detail. We'll maybe create 3-4 line items of...
Not that we're trying to preach at you.
We're not trying to preach.
Some good advice.
We might just talk some bullet points on...
I think people just need parenting in this area.
It's true.
They were never taught.
Well, no one's talking about it in a healthy sense.
Yeah.
People are trying to do the multi-level marketing Amway version of this and trying to bring some hype and put some glitz on it. But the reality is that the world is broken in this area.
Yeah.
Completely broken.
It's
like
true.
Things like Tinder have taken away the value of commitment. Commitment is gone, and options have opened up. Right across the board, even in the Christian world. And it's turned into a mess because God is a God of covenant. And this whole idea of options, it undergrades, it undermines, it devalues this whole concept of commitment. So what I think we'll do is, we're going to wrap this up right now, and we're going to jump into another one. And the next session, we're going to talk very specifically, guys, so make sure you look out for the podcast. We're going to talk specifically on how do I prepare myself for dating, not even marriage, for dating.
Yeah.
And what does that look like inside of that dating?
That's the first step.
Yeah.
Because you might have worked on yourself maybe with God, but then you're going to need some tips. You need some parenting to help you figure out.
And it's not in a condescending or demeaning sense.
No.
It's like we want you to do incredibly well. And we want you to have one spouse that you run with for the rest of your life. Yeah. The world needs to see believers that are faithful to each other for the rest of their lives, guys. Yeah. Anyway, so we're going to wrap this right now. We bless you. We pray that this has been an encouragement, maybe an awakening to you. If it really was like a lot of meat, go back and watch it again. Yeah. And I hope you're enjoying this series. God bless you guys.